Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Sklar, and I'm a senior advisor for education in crisis and conflict in the USAID Center for Education. Um, just on behalf of the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, or ECCN, I am really happy to welcome you to the Exploring New Evidence for Safe Learning Environments Gap Maps event. Today's gathering is part of the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network Learning Series. Just to situate this work a little, as most of you know, the 2018 USAID education policy states that children and youth, particularly the most marginalized and vulnerable, have increased access to quality education that is safe, relevant, and promotes emotional well-being. Safe learning environments have long been a priority for USAID, as we know that safety is a prerequisite for learning. To that end, ECCN has created a body of work around safe learning environments, of which the Safe Learning Environment Gap Map being presented today is a part. I'd also like to highlight our Safe Learning Environment Assessment Toolkit, a 3-day safe learning environment training, recommended indicators on safety, and of course, the Rapid Education and Risk Analysis Toolkit. Hallie will share links to these resources in the chat. Our learning series is meant to help members access, apply, and share evidence, resources, and tools related to topics drawn from USAID's Education in Crisis and Conflict Learning Agenda. Today's event on the SLE Gap Maps is particularly relevant to the ECCN Learning Agenda questions. Which education interventions are the most effective in improving student well-being in crisis and conflict contexts? What is the impact of well-being interventions on student learning outcomes in crisis and conflict settings? Just a few notes. While we are presenting in English, live interpretation is available in Spanish and French. To access the interpretation channels, please select the corresponding channel from the interpretation icon at the bottom or top of your screen. This is just a reminder that we are recording this session. It will be available on the Leading Through Learning Global Platform YouTube channel after the event. Before we dive in, I have a few reminders for you. First, closed captioning is available in English. To access this, click on the CC icon at the bottom or top of your screen. Second, we invite you to post questions or comments in the chat as you are listening. We will monitor the chat for questions as we go and have time to address some at the end. Please finally make sure you are muted and your camera is off to preserve bandwidth. The Education in Crisis and Conflict Network is part of the USAID Leading Through Learning Global Platform, which includes 2 other global learning networks, the Higher Education Learning Network and the Global Reading Network, as well as LTLGP regional representatives in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. We hope that you that in addition to staying tuned to ECCN, you'll be interested in collaboration across the platform. If you're not already a member, you can register now to receive invites to future events for all the networks and chapters, as well as other opportunities to convene with fellow members and engage. With that, it's really my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Cynthia Koons, who is the International Basic Education and Child Protection Advisor for the Education Development Center. Cynthia has over 20 years of experience in education in crisis and conflict, and is also the author of UNICEF's Risk-Informed Education Guide, Laos's National Disaster Reduction Education Contingency Plan, and even INE's conflict-sensitive education package. So welcome, Cynthia, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and great to be with all of you today. This session will begin with background on the previous Safe Learning Gap Maps, and then I will present this Gap Map update's objectives, methodology, findings, and gaps regarding 3 hazards to learner safety: climate change, mental health distress, and COVID-19. This systematic review was commissioned by the USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network. It was researched by me, managed by Haley Thomas, with advisory support from Kate Lapham, Larry Wilson, and many others. The 2011 USAID Education Strategy Goal 3 explicitly stated that safer learning opportunities for children and youth be provided. Towards this aim, in 2015, USAID commissioned a literature review and stakeholder consultation to map the evidence gaps regarding what works to keep learners safe. This original gap map included the hazard typology that you see here in black on the slide, and it was kept up to date until 2018. Because ECCN members found the original gap map so useful, in 2023, USAID sought to update the gap maps to integrate these 3 hazards: COVID-19, mental health distress, and climate change, which you see on the slide in red. While I'm speaking today, feel free to explore the gap map links posted in the chat. The new content rows are highlighted in yellow. We'll begin with the natural disasters map, followed by the health-related gap map. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. The intended outcomes of this SLE gap map update were for USAID and ECCN members to have access to updated evidence and to be able to apply it to safer learning environments. The update gap map methodology followed MORA's PRISMA systematic review method, which includes identification, screening, eligibility, and inclusion. You can see the steps and the number of documents included by each search stage here on the slide. In June of 2023, I identified the document pool by searching for the term equations you see on the left on Google Scholar Advanced Search. This was boundaried by publication years of 2019 to 2023. Then I screened by abstract the top 100 hits resulting from each search equation. I considered the article eligible if it addressed the specific hazards in the regional context, if it addressed the hazards in the school learning environment, and if it was not a duplicate. Finally, I included the article in this review if it was primary or secondary research, if it measured outcomes, and if it was methodologically robust, as guided by the USAID 2023 Assessment of Study Quality tool. There were limitations to this methodology, included biases of language. I searched in English, of publication. Studies that weren't published were not included. The publication year boundaries, of using a single search engine, and using the systematic review approach versus snowball sampling through reference lists. So let's take a look at some of the findings for each of the three hazards: climate change, mental health distress, and COVID-19. We'll begin with climate change. 15 studies supported the findings that climate change knowledge and attitudes can be taught in a structured way, and that this is associated with benefits such as learner resilience. A couple of studies highlighted that climate change education assessments continue to prioritize just physical infrastructure over other elements of climate change readiness, such as child participation, teacher training, or community readiness or preparedness. 7 studies spoke to how climate change-related infrastructure risk can be mitigated through comprehensive assessment frameworks, such as VISIS, NOTCM's, Fitzpatrick and West's, and the Comprehensive Safe Schools Framework, as well as through engineering, design, and construction. However, funding to address the findings of the facility's assessments remains a major limiting factor to climate change preparedness of schools. 5 studies supported the finding that child participation in climate change risk reduction is not only feasible, but can build confidence and agency in learners, particularly in addressing low magnitude, high frequency events. 6 studies demonstrated how vital community-based disaster risk reduction is. Examples offered were the Philippines typhoon response and the Nepal earthquake response. And in a rare appreciative inquiry study of local community disaster risk management in Zambia, illustrated how valuable indigenous responses will be to addressing future climate change challenges. In this Zambian example, the community organized ox carts for ferrying learners to school over floods, and they tracked water birds who indicated the onset of flooding. What were some of the evidence gaps in the literature regarding keeping learners safe from climate change? Fitzpatrick and West's 2022 comprehensive literature review identified 5 major evidence gaps in climate change interventions. First, interventions cost, value for money, and return on investment. Technical capacity required to implement the interventions. The level of effort needed by intervention. Impact data disaggregated by gender and disability. Impact and outcomes of improved infrastructure. And long-term data on what has worked. Many studies alluded to the need of research into pathways to evolve from simply national climate change policy intentions to school-level interventions. 5 studies spoke directly about the gap between national-level intention and school-level implementation. Now we'll look at a couple of the findings and gaps regarding mental health distress. Again, feel free to explore the maps while I'm speaking and to post questions in the chat to address at the end. 19 studies in this body of literature spoke to how positive school climate protects against mental health distress and lowers post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, emotional deregulation, and peer victimization. School climate interventions included teacher support, peer connectedness, affirming diversity, rule clarity, seeking help, and nurturing relationships. 6 studies addressed how social emotional learning improves social and emotional skills, reduces anxiety, and is valued by learners, teachers, and parents, although what is valued differed by these groups. 7 studies spoke about how psychosocial support and counseling are less common than physical safety interventions, can be provided by teachers, can be an alternative to corporal punishment, improve social connectedness, contribute to positive school culture, and promote academic performance. What were some of the gaps in this body of literature? Well, this review found similar problems in the research as those identified by the first SEL gap map, namely the conceptual complexities of defining and measuring mental health in reliable and valid ways across cultures. Yet, the review also revealed a renewed commitment to not accept this as a barrier and to proceed with innovative ways to meet the growing mental health needs of learners with contextualized and localized responses. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic provided an opportunity to continue to grow this mental health evidence base. Tellingly, this systematic review did not find any articles linking mental health treatment with safe learning outcomes. Concluding their extensive literature review of continuum of mental health in schools across all education cycles, Skeen and colleagues highlighted 2 major research gaps: policy implementation and program evaluation. Also missing in the literature is comparative outcome research on mental health support models, comparing, for example, school climate, psychosocial support, or social emotional learning programs, dosage, delivery modalities, and content. Let's move on to the final of the 3 hazards, COVID-19. 4 studies covered the moderation by school closures on learner health. Viner and colleagues reported that at the onset of COVID-19, 107 countries had implemented national school closures. Yet little was known about effectiveness of school closures as control for coronavirus outbreaks. Most studies, however, showed that infection and seroprevalence rates in schools that remained open were lower than those in the general community. And one explanation for this offered was that children had lower transmission rates. Another intervention, school leadership, was covered by 7 studies and identified as critical to the COVID-19 response. Chatspanagiatu's 2023 extensive literature review revealed the following promising crisis leadership practices: digital instruction, team building, school positive culture, two-way communication, connection to professional networks, attending to the socio-psychological needs of staff, having school resilience frameworks, and maximizing risk reduction. 10 studies explored the proliferation of remote and distance learning via modalities of paper learning packets, phones, radio, etc., and their high estimates of access outcomes, such as in Peru and Uganda. However, learning outcomes were rarely evaluated. 2 remote learning studies documented respective positive learning gains. A national reading radio program in Ghana, measured by FHI 360, and a Viamo mobile phone project in Afghanistan, measured by Save the Children. Finally, 4 studies spoke to the outcomes of remedial education. Quote, a robust body of evidence indicates that instruction focused on foundational literacy and numeracy skills that is targeted at students' individual levels, even if just 1 or 2 hours per day, can substantially improve learning. End quote. This was confirmed by 3 studies of catch-up clubs in Ghana, Colombia, and Uganda by Save the Children. What were some of the gaps in the literature about COVID-19 and learner safety? Intriguingly, this systematic review found no research on COVID-19 infrastructure adaptation, personal protective equipment, hygiene practices, or reporting, tracing, and notification. In a literature review of social distancing measures, Usher Pines found limited research on social practices to promote social distancing. Ladani's 2021 article urged the shift of focus from closures to, quote, assessing and implementing evidence-based mitigations to reduce the risk of infection in schools, end quote. This finding is noteworthy given the emerging learning regarding the negative impacts of school closures on learners' mental health, and thus the need for evidence on alternatives to closures. Second, Dabrowski 2022's article documented that during times of crisis, such as global pandemic and school closures, girls are at increased risk of child and forced marriage, early pregnancy, domestic and sexual violence. Thus, research is needed into which learners were not reached by all these distance learning efforts, which did not learn via these remote modalities, and what can be done to prepare for their inclusion in learning during the next pandemic. Another query to be explored is why some countries continued school closures for years after others opened and evidence showed minimal transmission control by school closures. Half a year after the first case in Brazil, 97% of learners in the Latin American and Caribbean region were deprived of normal schooling. What factors contributed to schools remaining closed in this region, even as other regions were opening? A fourth gap, similar to the mental health distress gap identified, there is a need for comparative studies for the myriad dosages, delivery modalities, and learning outcomes of remote learning. A couple of studies highlighted that supply of electronic platforms and content is not sufficient without monitoring actual usage and learning outcomes. And finally, school leadership in crisis management and disaster risk management is represented heavily in the literature. Several studies articulate the promising practices of school management in the COVID-19 response. The gap in research remains, however, about how to scale these promising school leadership practices. Okay, that includes the presentation on just a tiny bit of the findings and the evidence gaps. There is so much rich information in these studies, and I encourage you to navigate to the map and hover over the circles, and you can see the studies there. And where possible, we've included the active links to the actual research. The links to all the gap maps are posted in the chat. And today we focused on small bits of presentation on the top two in that list, the health-related threats and the natural disasters. Haley or Laurie, are there any questions in the chat that we can start with?
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, I've sent them to you if you want to look at your chat, or I can also read them out loud. Let me know.
Okay, let me scroll up. I see. Okay, so a question from Caroline. Are you planning to include more of the eligible studies that have been included? At this point, the literature, the systematic review and the documents that were included is closed. In the past, USAID has kept the gap map updated by reviewing new literature each year and updating it. And at this point, we don't know if that kind of updating will continue. So the literature that was included is a closed body of literature at this point. And another question from Caroline. Did you find data on climate change school closures, such as heat, as a reason for school closures? Excellent reflection. I too was looking for that, especially because I live in a very hot area where this is becoming an issue. I did not find any evidence on heat. Most of the evidence, just anecdotally speaking, about climate change and safety in schools is related to disaster risk reduction processes and not specific hazards. And even those that are specific hazards are focusing on earthquakes and floods. We don't see a lot of heat research yet. Caroline, feel free to come off mute if I didn't answer your questions or you have a follow-up question before I move on to the next. Okay, I'm going to ask my colleagues to follow up on the chat because I'm hovering over the bubble of questions that Haley sent me. So feel free to interrupt me if something comes up. The next question is from Mark. One issue that seems to have an evidence gap is the impact of toxic chemicals and pollution, including at schools and learning. You mentioned Zambia, and the Kabwe lead mine polluted homes, schools, play areas, and that still causes lead poisoning 30 years after the mine is closed. That's a very astute observation, Mark, and I would add to that research that I've done in Eastern European countries with reactors that are close to school environments and needing to monitor those chemical hazards. And I agree with your observation that chemical hazards are less represented in safe schools research at this point, and certainly a gap that could be addressed increasingly in the future. Okay, I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. Okay, I see some thank you for questions. Does anybody else want to come off mute as you look at the gap maps and comment or question any of the trends you notice? The visualization, I think, is quite helpful in identifying where the research has focused and what opportunities there are for future research. I'm going to ask, there she goes, Laurie, scrolling down. In the health-related map, for example. So there you see all those white rows, or the original gap map, and these pale yellow rows are the evidence that is mapped from the last 3 years on these 3 hazards. And you can see in the visualization the indication of the size of the blue circle for the number of evidence, the number of reports, I mean, that are supporting the evidence. They're great. Thanks for giving that example. We'll just pause for a couple minutes to.
Hi,
Please
this
go
is
ahead.
Caroline. I just had one comment there. I think there's a column that says something like school closure for mental health reason. Let me see if I find, yeah, reduced school closures for mental health reasons. Well, I've never heard of that. So I was wondering why, it just seemed like a funny idea to close a school for a mental health reason. And I was wondering why you, and there's no body of evidence, obviously, but I just wondered how somebody came up with that idea.
Yeah, that's a good observation. The text that I'm seeing in the column is reduce school closure disruption for health reasons, not mental health reasons, unless I'm missing something. And this outcome refers to closing the school for health reasons such as COVID-19.
Well, it does say mental health reason, so maybe it's just a typo. It's the column that's now somebody's highlighting. So if it was actually any school closure for health reasons such as pandemic or an epidemic, then it makes much more sense.
That's true. So this is alluding to, I think, the evolving body of evidence around closing or not closing schools because of the impact on learners' mental health. So what would be, so I think there isn't a lot of evidence in this column, but there is increasing interest in the impact of school closures on students' mental health. So that's sort of leaving a space for that body of evidence. Thanks, Caroline, for that question. Any other questions or comments? Okay, as I said, the literature is really rich, and we just touched the tip of the iceberg in this kind of summary presentation where we just shared some of the observations in order to sort of cultivate interest in these new visualization maps that you all have access to publicly. If you have any specific questions about research that I mentioned in the presentation or research that you see highlighted in the bubbles, please feel free to reach out to me. I found this to be a really fascinating study, and as I said, there are just a lot of nuances and rich learnings to be gained from this body of literature. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you for your kind attention. Oh, it looks like Laurie and Haley, I'll do the closing comments too. So on behalf of the USAID Education and Crisis and Conflict Network, I want to thank you for joining today's event. If you are not already a member of ECCN, you can join using the QR codes on the screen. You will receive updates about ECCN, including future events and opportunities to get involved. We hope to see you again at an upcoming event and wish you a great rest of the day.